Welcome everyone. Welcome back to our to a new calendar year, and we have an exciting year ahead of us with wonderful authors visiting us. And we are really excited to start off our year with Katya. I actually did not check with you, Katya. I hope I'm saying your last name correctly. Apekina. But she'll correct me once she when she begins to talk. I'm sorry I didn't check. So Katya is a novelist, a screenwriter, a translator, and she has a new book, which some of us have already read, some of us have not. The new book is called, it's a novel called Mother Doll, which is out now, obviously. Her debut, The Deeper Water, The Uglier the Fish, was named a Best Book of 2018 by Kirkus, BuzzFeed, and others, and was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize. Katya translated poetry and prose from Russian for Night Wraps the Sky, writings by and about Mayakovsky, which was shortlisted for the Best Translated Book Award. She grew up in Boston, went to school in New York, and now she lives in Los Angeles. And we're so excited to have you here, Katya. I'm going to turn things over to you. And please first tell me how I said your name.
You got it right. Good
Yay!
work.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. This is very exciting. I'm going to read a little bit from the book and then talk about, there'll be a Q&A. That's right? Yes, great. Okay. So this is my second book, Mother Doll. It came out in March. It's coming out in paperback next March. And I'm going to read, not from the very beginning, but from a little ways in. I think really the only thing you need to know is in the book, there's a character, Zhenia, who lives in Los Angeles, and she is pregnant, and she gets a call from a stranger. And I think that's really all you need to know right now, because I'm going to read and more will be revealed. Okay. The first time Paul called, Zhenia was lying in bed, looking at the succulents on the windowsill. They were furry with dust. How long had it been since anybody watered them? Ben was asleep next to her. He seemed different since coming back from the first round of filming in Atlanta. They'd given him an old-timey haircut, and the pomade he'd started using left halos of grease on the pillowcase. Why hadn't it occurred to her to water and wipe these plants while he was gone? Zhenia let the phone vibrate on the bed between them. She didn't recognize the number, so she let it go to voicemail. Ben groaned, turned toward the wall, and rearranged the pillow between his knees. She wondered when she would start feeling the baby inside of her and what that would feel like. When she'd Googled quickening, somebody on a message board described it as a flutter, but she couldn't really picture that feeling. A phone vibrating inside of her womb. This she could imagine. The call was coming from inside the house. She got up and boiled water for tea, then played the voicemail in case it was something work-related. There was a silence at first, and though she couldn't hear breathing exactly, there was clearly a person on the other end. Then finally, a man's voice. Hi, Zhenia. We haven't met. I'm calling about something. Well, I'd rather explain it to you, not to a machine. It's about a relative of yours. Zhenia set the tea kettle down. She turned to Ben on reflex, but didn't wake him. Which relative of hers could this message be about? Her brother, probably. He was just starting his freshman year now at Northwestern, a DJ on the side. Maybe he owed somebody money? After being under their mother's thumb for so long, it would make sense that he would now find an area in which to be immoderate. Her curiosity was piqued. She poured herself tea and called the number back. A man answered. Zhenia, he said, before she had a chance to introduce herself. I'm so glad you called. My name is Paul Zelmont. He had a wet way of speaking. She pictured him having thick, damp lips. I'm a medium. Perhaps you've heard of me? She hadn't. I'm well known in some circles. I have a website. She went over to her laptop and Googled him as he talked. The man who came up in the images looked eerily like what she'd been picturing, or perhaps what she'd pictured was vague enough that it transformed into this man. Head shaved bald, white stubble on his cheeks, prying eyes, And yes, thick, wet lips. She was right about that. On the website, it said he charged $350 for a 15-minute consult. I've been talking to your great-grandmother, he continued, and I need your help. Okay. Zhenya tensed and stepped out onto the balcony. For a scam, this seemed weirdly involved. Did she leave me an inheritance and you just need to know my bank account number so you can transfer me the money? The man laughed. Nothing like that. I know it's strange for you to be getting this call out of nowhere. Her name was Irina Petrovna. She's on your matrilineal line. Zhenya's grandmother had been raised in a Soviet orphanage for children of spies. This Irina had left her there and sailed to America. Baba Vera had been 4, old enough to understand abandonment both viscerally and cerebrally, and be haunted by it for the rest of her life. What would Irina's ghost want with Zhenya? Not that Zhenya even believed in this stuff, but if she did, it wouldn't make any sense. The whole thing was preposterous. She needs to tell you her story, her full story, and then once you have a complete picture, you can, if this feels right to you, and I very much hope it will, you can offer her forgiveness. We've discussed it, and the best way to go about all of this is to have her dictate us a memoir. She speaks English, Russian, Yiddish, German, and Hebrew, but she needs to dictate this in Russian to get anything honest. Her English-speaking self was founded on deception. So she can dictate her story to me, and you can translate. Then I'd like these memoirs to be published and for us to split the profits. This would be her legacy as well as your inheritance and my remuneration. I don't work pro bono for ethical reasons. It's a way of keeping healthy boundaries around my work. Zhenya turned and looked through the glass at Ben, who was sitting up in bed, awake now, looking at his phone. She raised her eyebrows to get his attention, but he was looking down, typing something into his phone and smiling. We can split 60-40, which is unusually high as far as translation fees, but you'd be doing more than just translating. Her story is for you. You'd be the one receiving it, so this seems fair to me. How does this sound to you? Zhenya paused. It sounded insane. As I mentioned, I don't speak Russian, he continued, so you will have to transcribe and translate, then send me whatever you have. She really is a fascinating woman. I've never done anything quite like this. It's taken a lot of legwork on my part to track you down. You couldn't just close your eyes and see my phone number? No, that's not how it works at all, he said wearily. I could see it had a 7 in it, but that was all I had to work with. Anyway, would now be a good time to start? Zhenya picked up a plastic water bottle next to the lawn chair she was sitting on. It was filled with cigarette butts. She shook it like a dirty snow globe. There was a strong impulse to stall. She had other children, other grandchildren and great-grandchildren who she was probably much closer to. Why wouldn't she go to them? No, they have nothing to do with this. She wanted it to be you. Your grandmother is indisposed. Your mother is not open to these sorts of messages. Because she's a scientist? No, I don't think that has very much to do with it. She's just closed off. Anyway, that leaves you, and I guess also the life you're carrying inside of you. Zhenya froze. Her pregnancy wasn't a guarded secret, but who knew besides Ben? Was this Ben's idea of a joke? Did Ben hire you to scare me? She set the ashtray water bottle down carefully and turned to look back through the sliding glass door, but it was her own reflection she was seeing, not Ben. I assure you, nobody has hired me, and my intention is certainly not to scare you. Your great-grandmother has enlisted me in a project that I think could benefit all of us, and she's eager to start. How did you know I was pregnant? Knowledge exists all around us, and as a psychic, I know how to interpret it. Zhenya blinked, not knowing what to believe. Is she here with me now? In a sense, spirits are in their own world, but there are places where you can overlap. Can she see what I'm wearing? Zhenya looked down at her peach terry cloth bathrobe. Can she see inside of me? I don't know. I don't think she can see your physical body. She's not near you in that sense. Then in what sense is she near me? Through me, I'm the channeler. Listen, do you have a pen and paper? I would like to begin. There was a level of genuine alarm in his voice, the way she sounded when she asked people in stores with no public restroom signs if she could use their restroom. Fine, Zhenya said, not certain she believed in any of this, but also curious about where this was going. She went back inside, got a pen and a notebook. If this is even real, then why does she feel like she needs my forgiveness? Zhenya muttered, adjusting her chair at the kitchen counter. She's dead. She got away with it, whatever it was. I'm starting, Paul Zelmont squeaked, not seeming to hear her. The words began to pour out. It was his voice still, not a falsetto or anything like that. But he was not a Russian speaker, and he clearly was struggling to make the necessary sounds with his face and tongue muscles. Zhenya translated in her head and transcribed the results as she went. Her hand moved quickly over the page, the Russian words coming out smoothly in English. She felt almost like she'd entered a trance. What? Ben asked, peeking out of the bathroom, the only other room in their studio apartment. Oh, I thought you were talking to me, he said, and closed the door behind himself. Thank you. Thanks. So do I just talk now or do you want to? Okay.
Yeah, so first of all, I don't think it's very nice of you to end on that note, because now I'm like, oh, what happened? Because I have not had a chance to read the book yet because of my holiday prep, but you have me on the edge of my seat.
Okay.
I would love for you to continue talking and tell us a little bit about your process, a little bit about like how how you got to this.
Sure. So I guess I'll start by just talking a little about the inspiration for writing this book. My grandmother um, left me these memoirs that she had written, and she had lived through World War II. She escaped. Her family was killed. She escaped from Poland on foot to Russia. Um, she had a really difficult life, and then she lived in the Soviet Union, and that was also, was its own form of difficulty. And she wrote these memoirs and gave them to me when I was a teenager, or maybe like in my early 20s. And they sat on my computer for years, and I could not bring myself to read them. And it wasn't because I wasn't interested in her story. I was very interested in her story, but I think I just felt like just a resistance, because it felt so emotionally heavy to take it on and hear exactly about what it was, what it was that was in this book. And so I didn't actually start reading them until she died, until the night of her funeral. I finally opened up the document, and it was in Russian, so I started translating it. Um, my daughter was very young at the time, but I thought that it would be something she would want to have. Um, and I was translating it, and I was also sort of like annotating it, asking questions. And it felt like I was in a dialogue with my grandmother after she died. And in some ways, it was a more maybe honest conversation than I ever would have been able to have with her when she was living. Um, and so I was talking to a text. I wasn't actually talking to her. But when I was thinking about this book, it's a person who's talking to a ghost of their great grandmother through a medium. And it's sort of the same, that was kind of the seed of that idea. And I was thinking a lot too, as I was reading her memoirs. It was so interesting because there were so many things that seemed sort of like my own sort of tics or weird things in my writing that I could trace back. Like she wasn't a writer, she was a chemical engineer, but her writing had a lot of similarities to my writing. And part of the similarities had to do with sort of um, these these details that are very mundane that suddenly feel very alarming for no reason. And so, as a person who grew up in the US, there was no like imminent constant danger for me growing up. And yet I had all of this like hyper vigilance all the time, and all of these sorts of things that I didn't really know what the source for them was. But reading her story, I could really kind of connect it. And it was also just really interesting to read her memoirs, because like the kinds of things that she would pay attention to, um, Like she would describe, like there was like half a page that was just describing her anxiety over my dad having constipation in summer camp. And then there's nothing about like her marriage, her meeting, her getting married to my grandfather. And it's just like, the things that she was paying attention to, like it was just so strange, as an outsider reading this, noticing almost like the absences as also very significant, the things she did pay attention to and the things she didn't. Um, so I was thinking about a lot of this, and I was thinking about, the inherited trauma, um, and what was sort of mine and what was handed to me. And as a recent parent, as a mother, I was thinking about, what I'm handing to the next generation, to my daughter. And, a lot of times these things that are passed down, they're not consciously passed down, they're unconsciously passed down. So just kind of connecting, seeing myself as a link in this chain and sort of connecting it. I just was thinking a lot about that. And so when I was working on this novel, I wanted to explore that using these sort of techniques that, I guess I think of as like sort of Soviet magical realism, these fantastical elements that take it out of sort of the real world. And part of that is like the books that I grew up reading that I really loved, like Bulgakov, Master and Margarita was a book that I really loved growing up. And there's just other Soviet literature that really uses like the absurd, and it uses this sort of dark humor as a way of talking about serious things, And this book does, I think, that's what I was trying to do with this book as well. Um, and I'm happy to answer any sort of questions or talk about anything else related to my process or the book.
I'm gonna go to Mark, but what can you just talk a little bit more about like the absurd, the piece of like using the absurd, like as a literary device in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of the absurd. I think oftentimes when we're in very intense, like emotional situations, sometimes it's something external that just feels completely disjointed and jarring, and the two things kind of butting up against each other feels really absurd. Like I could, I guess, give an example. There's a scene where somebody is being uh, rushed to the hospital, and the EMT stops to like take a piece of fruit from the fruit bowl, and it's just like it feels like such a violation for her to see that, but it's just like, why? It's just such a random detail, but there's just something about like, I guess, the seriousness of the situation and like the unprofessionalness of suddenly like reaching into somebody's fruit bowl when you're supposed to be like taking them to the hospital, like something like that. And I feel like those are also often like the kinds of details that I notice too when I'm in these like emotionally heightened situations. It seems like, well, why am I noticing that? But I think it's probably like a coping mechanism because it kind of removes you a little bit from that situation. And it also like reminds you that the world is somehow bigger than this sort of hyper focus that you often have in those types of crisis situations. So I don't know. That's just one example of absurdist.
And it adds so much color to what you're saying. Mark,
Okay.
do you want to go? Do you want to go now? Okay, so I'm gonna Mark, and then we'll call. I see Nancy and Roberta both have their hands raised.
Sure.
Hi. I'm glad to hear you're a fan of Master and Margarita because, I mean, that's the first thing I love that book. And it's the first thing that came to mind when I started reading your book.
Oh,
A lot of things I'd like to ask you, but I guess I'll start with, I mean, this is a book about generational trauma. And it seems like, I can't, Zhenia?
uh-huh.
Uh, that she's attempting to break the generational trauma by not having children, but that doesn't work. And I guess I'd like to know what your thoughts are on that. And you know, is this something that's inevitable? Is generational trauma just going to happen? And what is the answer to it? How do you end the cycle?
Oh, that is such a good question. Yeah, so Zhenia is young. She's in her early 20s. She gets to just give people who haven't read it some context. She gets pregnant with her husband. They had been planning on not having children, but she decides she wants to have a child, which blows up her marriage. And then she starts talking with her great grandmother, who's a Russian revolutionary, and who had abandoned her grandmother, who was someone she was very close with growing up. Um, and I guess to answer your question of like, how do you not pass on generational trauma? I don't know. I mean, I think that was probably what I was trying to answer for myself as I was writing this book. But I do feel like just reckoning with it and looking at it, talking about it, and like having empathy for it in some way, and for your past selves, your ancestral, like you contain your ancestors, you contain past versions of yourself, and I think like a lot of it has to do with sort of reconciling all of those parts of yourself and having compassion for them and seeing them, and I think that's probably the only way to I don't know if heal generational trauma. I don't know that it disappears, but maybe to coexist with it, to not be fighting with it, to maybe even honor it in some way. But it is something, the character of Zhenya is very she's in some ways kind of stunted and very frozen. If you have response to trauma, it can be fight, flight, or freeze. And her response is very kind of frozen, like she's not very fully actualized in the beginning. And getting pregnant and deciding to have this child, which is like a choice that seems like it creates a lot of problems ostensibly for her. It breaks her marriage. It creates a lot of difficulty for her to make that choice. But it's kind of like the first active choice that she makes that feels like it's being really generated from her own desire. And the book is about her sort of connecting to that desire and understanding that. Because I think it's very common to when you've inherited that kind of trauma, to be sort of like frozen a little bit, and to feel sort of disconnected from yourself. And so I think in the process of connecting with herself, she's also processing her, what is being handed down to her in terms of ancestors. And then as for the first part of the question having to do with Master and Margarita, I read that book so many times growing up, and I even directed a play version of it when I was in middle school. I just loved it so much. And for those who haven't read it, it's like it's kind of, there's multiple strands to the story, but in one strand, basically Satan comes down with his crew to Moscow and kind of wreaks havoc. And then there's this writer who's in an insane asylum, and he's writing this novel that's about Pontius Pilate. And it's like all the way that all of these strands kind of come together is very interesting.
Yeah, it's a great book. Highly recommended to anybody.
Yeah.
Mark, do you have any follow-up questions, or should I?
No, that was very good. Let somebody else go.
Okay, thanks.
Mark.
Okay. Nancy.
Hi. Boy, there was so much going on in this book, and I'm a folklorist, so I'm used to hearing stories about families, from earlier generations that have been passed down, and the concept of having a communication in an alternative universe is something I'm comfortable with. But I want to hear from you why you decided to use that medium and that form of communication. Was there something that is in part of your family's culture that helps us understand the whole dialogue in these different times?
Yeah, great question. I could have written a book where it was just a person who was reading a memoir, like what had actually happened to me, right? Reading a grandparent's memoir or something. But it felt a lot more dynamic to have, instead of interacting with the text, to have it be interacting with with this ghost, with Irina. And so I sort of used that device, and I did take some mediumship classes and did a lot of research about mediumship when I was writing it. And when I was writing the book, also my grandfather, who I grew up with and was very close with, he died. And it kind of shifted. Like, I had been taking these mediumship classes, and it was just sort of like a fun kind of concept or idea. But then when it kind of shifted from that to feeling this sort of desire to actually be in contact with somebody that I loved who died, it kind of felt less good to me, actually. The mediumship stuff felt more fake. It didn't feel very real to me. But I did have several experiences in dreams where dead relatives have visited me that felt very, I felt visited. I mean, I don't know how to describe it. It's one of those things where you can't really convince anyone else who hasn't experienced it of what your experience is, but it was very much clear to me in the dream that it felt like a visitation. It didn't feel like a dream about this grandparent. It felt very much like I just was in their presence and I was with them. So that happened to me once with my paternal grandfather. And it just was so lovely. Like, we just were in this dream together, and I felt his presence, and it was great. But then with with my other grandfather who died while I was writing the book, I think it felt a little bit scary when he visited me in a dream, because I had been sort of complaining that, he wasn't visited, that I didn't really feel his presence after he passed away. And I was with him on his deathbed. He was like dictating his memoirs to me too. I feel like I come from a family of people who just have a lot that they want to set down for future generations, and he was really like not ready to die. He was very, he just had more he wanted to finish to say. But anyway, when he visited me in a dream, I just suddenly heard his voice in my ear in the dream, and I immediately woke up because it scared me, and it felt, I don't know, I guess I wasn't ready for it. So I don't know, I feel like I've had like some amount of sort of these occult or otherworldly experiences, but not really. And it's not like, this is, I guess, technically a ghost story because it is someone talking with a ghost. But it's funny because when people have described it that way, I always feel a little confused. But it is literally a ghost story. It just doesn't, I think, feel like what you would think of when you think of a ghost story, because it's treated so realistically. And then as for why I wanted a medium, I loved having a person that had nothing to do with this family who was somehow just inserted into the story, and then getting his perspective. And, he has his own backstory, his own set of concerns, his own reasons for why he's participating in this project. And he ends up, not to give anything away, but he ends up being deeply, I'll say, affected by this project. So I just thought it was interesting having this like outside perspective. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.
You're muted, Rabbi.
Roberta.
Yes. Hi, I have a question. I came in when you started reading the book. So at the beginning, I don't know, I didn't hear the introduction from the rabbi, so I don't know if this was already said. But obviously your background is Russian, and that your grandparents on both sides are Russian.
I was born in Russia. My grandmother, on my dad's side, my grandmother was Polish. They're all from the Soviet Union.
Oh, okay.
Not necessarily Russian. Yeah.
Okay.
And I was born in Moscow. My grandfather was Belarusian, I think. My other grandfather was, I don't know, he moved around a lot. He was born in Tashkent, but then he lived north of the Arctic Circle, and he has family in Ukraine. And then my my other grandmother was Russian. I mean, Russian Jewish, but
Okay.
yeah.
But you were brought up by your mother and father, right? Your parents, not
Yes.
a grandparent. So I
I was
was just
brought up by
curious.
both.
Oh, did you live with your grandparent, your mother's
Yes.
mom? Your
Mhm.
mother's so I was just curious because you're talking about generational, trauma, and you went from a great grandmother, your grandmother, that in this book,
Mhm.
the character was extremely close to. So I assume you were close to grandma. But when you said to me that your grandmother left you the memoirs, her memoirs that you didn't open until after she passed on, she didn't share them with your mom? Like
That
that
was
was
my
between you
paternal.
and your mother?
That was my paternal grandmother.
So she didn't leave them to your father? In
He
other
had
words,
them too, and he read them. Yeah.
oh, he did. So it wasn't,
Yeah.
I misinterpret. I thought she just left them to you and you were the
No,
only one she shared them with. And I'm saying, well, she didn't share them to your parent. Oh, to your dad. So
she
she
did.
did.
She did share them with my dad, and my dad did read them. Yeah.
Prior to her death, did he read them? Do you know?
Yeah, he read them prior to her death. And
And
my
when
brother, I have a brother also, and he also read them.
oh, so she shared, and when they read them when she was alive, I would imagine maybe they had questions that they wanted. Like, did they share it? That they asked when she was alive, that they learned about her, that they, the things that you pointed out, like, Grandma, you're worried about, Daddy having diarrhea, and yet what about your relationship with your husband or being constipated? What if you said she chose to? That's just so, curious.
I don't know if that's a kind of, well, I can't imagine that that's something my dad would have pointed out and like gotten into a conversation
Your
with my
brother?
dad. I don't think that was the nature of the relationship.
Mhm.
And I don't think my brother would have, I think like when you're in the family unit, the way that your family is doesn't seem strange, it's only kind of when you get some distance from it that you're able to even be like, oh, that's kind of an interesting detail. What does this mean? This is maybe unusual. If it's not unusual to you, if that's what you grew up with, you
Right.
wouldn't really, I think, notice it,
But she did share it with others. I thought she just shared her memoir with you.
She did. Yeah, she did.
That's lovely. How lovely is that? How special.
Yeah.
You should do that for your daughter. Make
Leave
sure
a
you write your
memoir.
life, right?
Maybe. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
good thing to think about. I mean, I think, my daughter probably can just ask me and knows a lot about my life already.
Does she?
There's something about like a generation down that's I think that's like particularly special because you're more removed from it. You don't know what their life was like as, what their childhood or what their youth or whatever as much.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thanks, Roberta. I'm gonna go to Dorothy, who has our next question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great, great. First of all, thank you for the book. Full disclosure, I'm halfway through, but and that's not because of any other reason than timing. But there are two things that really intrigue me tremendously on a personal level. One is, of course, the relationship with the granddaughter and the grandmother, or it's your grandmother, not your great grandmother, correct?
For Viera, her grandmother is sort of sick and dying in the book, and the great grandmother is the ghost. Yeah.
Well, I don't regard this as sort of a scary ghost story at all, but
Right.
an intimate connection. I was virtually raised by my grandmother, Russian Polish woman who did not speak English and who was kind of superstitious and very religious, Jewish. And so a lot of this made me sort of smile to myself. Oh, my nanny would have said that kind of thing, you know. I heard about the Cossacks running through the town and cutting people's heads off with their swords. And her husband, who at 16, they were married, hid her away on the rooftop of a building so that she wouldn't be raped. And he ran out to buy bread, to steal bread in the middle of the night to make sure that they had food. I mean, this 16 years old, you know, and I was probably 16 when she told me the story. So, I mean, these are not made up fantasies. These are historical things. So, two things about this really, really grabbed me. One is that there is this relationship with someone who has passed away. I don't view it as a scary ghost story at all. And I want you to know that I'm a science person. I'm a physician. So, you know, I'm not like in this world of do kind of thing. I think that there are certain connections with people we were very close to, religiously, whatever, that allow us to feel what they felt or feel a closeness with them even long after they're gone. And my daughter is named for my grandmother, and that brings me a great deal of comfort. The other thing I wanted to point to is Rasputin. As a physician, I've always been interested in the character of someone who had the capacity in some way, maybe it was all, what's the word, placebo effect, but in some way to affect a cure in someone who had a physical disability. And what was the hormone that that person was able to release? Rasputin was a person like that. He was, quote, a healer, unquote. And my grandmother never mentioned him. So that wasn't part of our history. But I was wondering, like, that was part of your family history, or was that added into the story, the relationship with Rasputin?
No, I would say none of it is part of my family history, none of the historical stuff. Like my great grandmother, well, first of all, my great grandmother was born after the revolution anyway, but I guess even her mother was not involved in the revolution in any direct way, as far as I know. I don't think she was. And I did a lot of research, reading like diaries, reading journals, reading oral histories. I wasn't really drawing on my family's history for any of it, you know? And even though it's interesting, because I feel like, I think a lot of times people assume that people are writing in some way about themselves. And I guess I'm writing about myself in the sense that I'm also an immigrant. I also have like thought about a lot of these questions of feeling, you know, that that loss of wherever I was from. And also as like a Soviet Jew, you know, just the inherited trauma of everything in the Holocaust and my family and growing up in the Soviet Union. Like all of those are things that I think about, but the actual characters and the actual stories don't match up with my own biography. And with my first book too, I feel like it's just, I think because this one is also about an immigrant, there's maybe like people will assume that it's more about me than my first book, which was about people from the American South. So, but it just isn't, you know, I very rarely write about myself. I don't, I just feel a lot more freedom when I'm writing about someone completely different from me. And I'm also just a lot more curious about, like, I know how my mind works, you know, it doesn't really interest me as much, but I'm always just like, why, you know, Zhenia seems like in some ways like a person who's kind of frustrating to me in some ways, in terms of the choices she makes, in terms of the way she sort of exists in the world. and I think it's just me trying to understand, like, why is she the way that she is? Why is that person the way that she is? And, you know, to understand why she is the way that she is, you have to kind of understand that her mother was the way that her mother was and her grandmother was, and, you know, and it all kind of goes back to her great grandmother. And it was just really interesting for me to explore that. But there's no, like, my family didn't have any connection with Rasputin. I was reading this woman, Teffy, who was a journalist at the time of the Revolutionary War, and she wrote about this like party she went to with Rasputin. And that sort of inspired me. I mean, he went to a lot of parties. Anybody who went to parties in St. Petersburg and was like in that sort of, in those sorts of elite social circles would have probably seen him there, you know. I don't think it was super unusual, but it wasn't, I don't think anyone in my family had anything to do with any of that.
None in my family for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Dorothy. So I'm just wondering, at the end of last year, we had an author who was talking about his writing process, and I cannot even imagine writing this way myself, but he said that he basically, you know, he had an outline of his book, and he, you know, knew what he was going to be writing about, and he would just kind of work through from page 1 to page whatever, and he just went in order, and that's how he did it. What's your writing process like? How do you, you know, how do you do that?
I think I definitely have outlines, but my outlines evolve a lot as I go. It's not what I start with is not what I end up with. Because so much of the kind of discoveries I'm making along the way as as I'm writing. Like that's what makes it exciting, is not knowing exactly where it's going to go. For me, I mean, I sort of knew that it was headed towards some sort of reckoning, you know, and some sort of reconciliation at the end. And I sort of knew what the shape of the book was. But then yeah, I think, but beyond that, like my outline was pretty flexible and it sort of evolved. And I was doing, I think I mentioned, a lot of research, and it was sort of I started with actually the research before I started anything else. I knew I wanted to write about the Russian Revolution, but I didn't know what that, you know, that's a huge subject. I didn't know where exactly in that I wanted to explore. And so I spent quite a lot of time just reading sort of widely and then sort of narrowing it down. And then it sort of got to this point where I was like, well, I'm never going to be a true expert on this. I'm not a historian. And I could just procrastinate research forever. I could just research endlessly. Like there's no end in sight, you know? So I had to just kind of stop and then just research alongside whatever I was writing so that it wasn't like two separate things. I wasn't just researching until I felt like I knew enough to just get started, and then I kind of kept researching alongside what I was writing. And a really interesting thing would happen when I was researching and when I felt really like deep and immersed in it. It really would feel like the story would kind of flow through me in a way that felt very intuitive, organic. It didn't feel like I was necessarily guiding it. It felt more like I was receiving it or channeling it or something like that. So I guess to go back to the question of like, why write about a medium? I mean, the mediumship classes that I took it's a process that feels very similar to writing, to channel that sort of thing, is to just kind of shut off your critical mind and let whatever come through. And I think, sometimes that's easier to do when you have some container for that process. And so having an outline can be really helpful, because otherwise you can just kind of, it's hard, I think, to like it's easy to lose track of the bigger picture, where you're going, if you don't have some sort of map for yourself. but it's also nice to keep it sort of flowing and intuitive too, and to have the option to kind of be flowing and intuitive within whatever constraints that you kind of set for yourself.
Thanks. I'm going to turn things to Marcia for her question.
Hi.
Hi.
This was one of the most unusual books I've ever read. It was not what I expected and fascinating. But everything in reading it, a couple of things in reading it, it made me very curious about where you came from to be writing this. And you've answered a lot of that in your talk, and you're answering other questions. Your grandma's memoir, did you grow up speaking Russian? Did your family all?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I grew up speaking Russian. My grandmother, I think, spoke 7 or 8 languages. She spoke so many languages. But she spoke Russian with us too.
Okay, I was curious about that. And the topic of epigenetics and inherited trauma and all of that has been fascinating to me. And I always, it's a relatively new discipline, as it were, being researched and all. And I, connected very strongly to the experiences in Jewish history. So if it's not out of turn, and I know you promoted this through the Jewish Book Council, so I sort of expected there to be, or I thought there would be a lot more about like the Jewish experience in particular, or, and I was well into the book, and it was like, I had to remind myself, now you mentioned it occasionally that the mother of the great grandmother was Jewish, but then turned anti-Semitic during the revolution, I think. But there was a lot less of mentioning of Judaism at all throughout the book. And I was just curious about whether that was deliberate decisions, or it just wasn't relevant to the story, or it's not part of the Soviet experience, so it didn't. I'm just curious how that all shook out.
Yeah, I mean, so I left the Soviet Union at the age of 3. So from kind of my sense in the Soviet experience, your Jewish identity is it's like an ethnicity, like it'll say you're Jewish on your passport, but so you could be Jewish without having any religion at all, or there wasn't a lot of religion in the Soviet, it was very difficult to practice any religion. And just a lot of people were secular anyway, who were living in the big cities. So I feel like it's kind of an interesting thing where you both have like an identity as a Jewish person, but there's none of the religious knowledge that goes with that. For at least for my parents, that's definitely the case. With my grandparents, they were raised with more of it. But for my parents, it just wasn't really there. So it's, yeah, I don't know. So, and I sort of think it was kind of for the characters, it was sort of like a similar thing where it was both like they were secular Jews very much. So yeah, growing up in the Soviet Union. But I don't think that in terms of, well, I think for her great grandmother, her Jewish identity is sort of like more a bigger part of the story. And also she's living with her cousin who is, she's half Jewish. Her cousin is fully Jewish in the story. But for Zhenia, if you're asking about what her Jewish identity is, I think she's pretty secular, as a lot of Soviet Jews were.
I guess I was thinking also in terms of Irina's experiences, where it was mentioned, but it didn't really play into her role before she came to America,
Right. Yeah. I mean, her cousin is who she lives with is Jewish, and she's Jewish on her mother's side, but not on her father's side, and so raised pretty much without any sort of religion. except for sort of what she absorbs through her cousin. But then when she immigrates to America, that that changes, and she sort of builds a whole new identity for herself.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Marcia. I'm gonna give the last question to Mark, because he's got his hand up again.
Hi. Okay. So, once again, a few questions I could ask, but I'm going to try not to get too much into spoiler territory. And one thing I kind of struggled with reading the book is the role of the grandmother. I mean, is it a positive role? Is it a negative role? Because, I mean, just as, her mother abandoned her, she sort of stole her grandchild from the child's mother. And, which probably contributed to her problems more than helped her. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so there's so to give sort of some context for people, Zhenya grew up with her mother, Marina, and her grandmother, Vera, and she's very close with her grandmother. And she has a pretty strained relationship with her mother. And her grandmother is like very nurturing towards Zhenya, but the kind of person she is as a grandmother is not necessarily the kind of person she was as a mother. She was a pretty cold mother to Zhenya's mother. Sorry if I'm saying mother like so many times in a row, but they're sort of in this triangle, and after Zhenya's grandmother dies, the relationship between Zhenya and Marina kind of has space to evolve, because the grandmother is she did like take over her grandchild basically and took her as her own. I mean, they all lived in the same home together, but it's like in an emotional sense, she took over. And there was sort of not space for Zhenya and her mother to have a real close relationship, because the grandmother is sort of overbearing in some of these ways. And Zhenya feels, you're getting this more from Zhenya's point of view, so she feels like a lot of love for her grandmother, and a lot of she feels like a strong allegiance to her, and it feels almost like a betrayal for her to have a close relationship with her mother, because her grandmother sort of controls that. And so yeah, I think it's complicated, because Zhenya loves her grandmother. Her grandmother is deeply flawed, like anyone is, but it's not a healthy dynamic. And as a mother, Vera was very cold, and she hadn't really even wanted to have children. And she had a child because her husband really wanted one, but it wasn't something she wanted. And she was kind of in competition with her daughter for her husband's love, is how it was their sort of unhealthy dynamic. And then they continued to live together once they all immigrated together, but Vera and Marina, were not close and had a very strained relationship.
Oh, thank you. And I meant to ask one other thing, the quick question. Are you working on anything now?
Yes, I am working on a new novel. It's very, very, very early, in the very early stages, but it's been very fun to start something new. Yeah, it's been fun.
No hints though, huh?
No, I don't think so. Not yet.
Okay.
Still too
Thank you.
early. I don't want to, I'm superstitious.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Well, I can't thank you enough, Katya. This has been totally fascinating, and I think for anyone who has read the book, probably I know for sure some questions were definitely answered. But also you've created a lot of space for us to continue to think about, what this book is all about and what we can learn from it. And for those of us who haven't read the book, I think you now have us on the edge of our seats, ready to, I want to know what happens next. So it will be waiting for me after Yom Kippur. And and I'm looking forward to reading the whole story. And we'll also be looking forward to see to see what comes from you next, from your really fascinating mind and imagination. So thank you so much. There is I'll just read this comment. Thank you so much for joining us and discussing your most interesting book. Good luck on your next work. That comes from our friend Nancy Solomon. So anything else you want to say before we go, Katya?
No, this was just such a pleasure. I really enjoyed talking with all of you and your thoughtful questions. So thank you so much for reading and for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So friends, that brings us to the end of our program this evening. If you can see, I'm just going to highlight for a second Marcia, because she has the book with her, so you can hold up your copy. So the book is Mother Doll by Katya Apekina. Apekina, did I say it right? Yeah,
You said
can
it
you say it? It's going to sound better with your Russian accent.
Katya Apekina.
Oh, so it sounds like I do.
Exactly the same.
Spelled like it sounds. And pick up your copy if you don't have it already. And thanks again for coming. Thanks, Katya. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.